Imagine a face that history is strictly forbidden to see. By the late 19th century, the American frontier was heavily documented by the glass plates of the camera. Generals, scouts, and even captive indigenous chiefs sat rigidly for portraits, their images cataloged in Washington archives. But one man vehemently refused. He believed the camera lens stripped away a fragment of the soul. He never signed a treaty. He never voluntarily lived on a reservation. He could not be bought. He could not be bribed. And he could not be broken. He did not ride into battle wearing the massive, trailing, eagle feather headdresses you have been conditioned to expect. That was for men who sought status. He wore a single red-tailed hawk feather in his hair. A yellow lightning bolt was painted across his face, and his body was dusted with the pale earth of gopher mounds. His name was Tecumseh Whitco, Crazy Horse. His perceived invincibility was not a matter of luck. It was rooted in a profound, psychological armor forged during a childhood vision quest. As an adolescent, he went alone into the Black Hills, fasting for days without water until his physical limits were shattered. In his delirium, he saw a warrior rising from a lake, riding a horse that seemed to float above the ground. A massive storm broke over the rider. Lightning crashed, and a hail of enemy bullets flew toward him, but they dissolved before touching his skin. A red-backed hawk flew above his head. The vision came with a strict, unbreakable contract. The spirits told him he would remain impervious to the invaders' lead as long as he adhered to absolute selflessness. He was forbidden from fighting for personal glory. He was forbidden from taking a trophy, and he was forbidden from claiming a scalp. In a warrior culture where taking scalps and counting coup was the sole metric of social elevation, Crazy Horse became a lethal anomaly. He did not fight to boast around the campfire. He fought with the cold, single-minded focus of destroying the enemy. He was a shield for his people, not a harvester of the dead. To understand the sheer, unadulterated rage of the Oglala Lakota, you must look at the cynical machinery of American expansion. In 1851, the United States government drafted the Treaty of Fort Laramie. It was a formal, legally binding document guaranteeing the absolute sovereignty of the Sioux over the Powder River country, a pristine, game-rich expanse of the high plains stretching across Wyoming and Montana. But treaties are written on paper, and paper burns easily when it is rubbed against gold. In the early 1862s, prospectors discovered precious metals in the Montana Territory. Suddenly, the guaranteed sovereign land was an obstacle to federal wealth. The U.S. government authorized the establishment of the Bozeman Trail. This was not a simple dirt path. It was a heavy wagon supply route that cut a mechanical scar straight through the sacred hunting grounds of the Lakota. The constant noise, the thousands of grazing draft animals, and the diseases brought by the settlers effectively destroyed the fragile migratory patterns of the American bison, threatening the tribes with immediate starvation. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, calculated invasion. The military marched in and began erecting a chain of wooden forts along the trail to protect the miners. The Oglala, led by the elder statesman Red Cloud and his brilliant young tactician, Crazy Horse, realized a harsh reality. The word of the federal government was entirely worthless. Treaties were merely tactical pauses used by the Americans to consolidate supply lines. The only language the invaders understood was kinetic force. By December 1866, the American garrison at Fort Phil Kearny was in a state of constant, shivering paranoia. The temperature had plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Wood splintered when struck with an axe. Blood froze before it hit the ground. The Lakota had effectively besieged the fort, cutting off their wood-gathering details and harassing their patrols, slowly draining the fort's morale and supplies. Inside the palisades was Captain William J. Fetterman. He was a veteran of the bloody meat grinders of the American Civil War, steeped in the arrogance of traditional military doctrine. He held the indigenous fighters in absolute contempt. He famously boasted to his superiors, "Give me 80 men, and I will ride through the whole Sioux nation." Crazy Horse intended to give him exactly 80 men and a grave. On the freezing morning of December 21, the Lakota executed a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Crazy Horse personally led a small, highly visible group of warriors to attack the fort's wood train. When Fetterman rode out with exactly 80 soldiers to rescue the loggers, the decoy party broke contact and began to retreat up the icy, treacherous slope of Lodge Trail Ridge. Crazy Horse played the role of the wounded, desperate target with terrifying perfection. The key to a successful decoy is making the enemy believe you are vulnerable. Crazy Horse would stop his horse, dismount in the snow, and pretend to check its hooves, allowing the American cavalry to get just within rifle range. The soldiers fired. The bullets missed. The bait was simply too tempting. Fetterman, blinded by his own hubris and the desire for a swift, glorious victory, violated his direct, explicit orders not to pursue past the high ground. He led his command over the crest of the ridge, losing all visual contact with the fort, and dropped down into a blind ravine where the trap was set. Waiting in the frozen sagebrush, buried under the snow with their hands over their mouths to hide the condensation of their breath, were 1,000 Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Despite the lethal cold, many had stripped down to their breechcloths, knowing that heavy buffalo robes would interfere with the rapid drawing of a bowstring. When Crazy Horse gave the signal, the trap snapped shut. It was not a battle, it was an industrial-scale execution. The ambush was so overwhelming, the volley of arrows so thick, that the sky physically darkened. An estimated 40,000 arrows were loosed in a matter of minutes. The entire American command was liquidated in less than half an hour. There was no retreat, and there were no survivors. The official reports of Colonel Henry B. Carrington, the commander of Fort Phil Kearny, who had the grim task of retrieving the bodies, read like a dispatch from hell. He documented the frozen, stripped remains of Fetterman's men. He noted that the corpses were pinned to the frozen earth by dozens of arrows, their blood turned to solid red ice. Carrington's report shattered the illusion of American supremacy on the plains. It proved that the native forces were not disorganized bands of primitive raiders, but a highly disciplined, tactically superior army capable of executing complex, multi-stage maneuvers. A decade later, the United States government repeated its own treachery. A new gold rush erupted, this time in the Black Hills of South Dakota, the absolute spiritual center of the Lakota universe. The treaties were ripped to shreds. The gold-hungry empire marched in once more to protect the trespassers and force the remaining free indigenous bands onto reservations. This campaign culminated on the searing, dusty afternoon of June 25, 1876, along the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana. General George Armstrong Custer, leading the 7th Cavalry, intended to launch a surprise kinetic strike on a massive, sprawling encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne. Custer operated on the flawed assumption that the native warriors would scatter and flee to protect their families at the sight of the blue uniforms. He divided his forces, critically weakening his own command. He rode directly into a buzzsaw. while the elder chief Sitting Bull remained in the camp to protect the non-combatants and maintain the spiritual integrity of the defense. Crazy Horse took command of the counterattack. When Major Marcus Reno's troops assaulted the southern end of the camp, they were instantly repelled, driven into a panicked, bloody retreat across the river, abandoning their weapons in the mud. But the true tactical genius was unleashed against Custer's detachment at the northern end of the village. Crazy Horse did not panic when the shooting started. He calmly performed his rituals, rubbing the dust of a gopher mound onto his skin and tying the single hawk feather into his hair. Then, he rallied his warriors with a battle cry that would echo through the decades. "Hoka hey! Today is a good day to die." This was not a blind, screaming frontal charge. It was a highly coordinated flanking maneuver. While other chiefs engaged Custer from the front, pinning the cavalry in place, Crazy Horse led a massive force of riders up a hidden deep ravine, completely outflanking the 7th Cavalry and slamming into their exposed rear. He compressed the American troops into a tight, panicked pocket on a dusty rise known today as Last Stand Hill. The tactical reality of Little Bighorn is often ignored by mythmakers. The Indians were not armed just with bows. Through aggressive trading, they possessed hundreds of repeating Henry and Winchester rifles. The 7th Cavalry were armed with single-shot Springfield carbines, which notoriously jammed when the copper cartridges expanded in the overheated breeches. Custer's men were reduced to frantically prying jammed casings out of their rifles with knives while under heavy fire. The testimonies of indigenous survivors, such as the Northern Cheyenne warrior Wooden Leg, described a scene of absolute blinding chaos. The air was so choked with alkaline dust and thick gray gun smoke that men fought blind, swinging rifle butts and war clubs. Wooden Leg recounted how the deafening roar of repeating rifles and the screams of dying horses turned the hill into a slaughterhouse. Crazy Horse rode directly through the American lines, his hawk feather cutting through the smoke, untouchable, breaking the last defensive formations of the cavalry. Custer's entire detachment of 210 men was wiped off the map. It was the greatest indigenous victory in the history of the continent, but it was also the beginning of the end. The Lakota won the Battle of Little Bighorn, but they could not win the physics of the war. The United States military, humiliated and enraged by the loss of their golden general, stopped trying to outfight the Lakota and decided to simply starve them. General George Crook and Colonel Nelson A. Miles launched a relentless, total war winter campaign. They bypassed the warriors and targeted the logistics. They destroyed the massive herds of bison, deliberately liquidating the indigenous supply chain. They attacked the winter camps, burning the teepees and destroying the caches of dried meat, forcing the bands out into the sub-zero blizzards without food or shelter. By the spring of 1877, Crazy Horse faced a grim, inescapable calculus. His people were freezing. His warriors were emaciated, their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue just to stay warm. The infants were dying of starvation. The man who had never lost a battle to the Americans realized he had to sacrifice his own absolute freedom to keep his people alive. He could not fight the weather, and he could not fight the limitless treasury of the U.S. government. In May of 1877, under the promise of a peaceful settlement and a reservation in his own homeland of the Powder River, Crazy Horse led his ragged, exhausted band into Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and surrendered his weapons. The American command was terrified of him. Even without a rifle, his sheer presence commanded absolute, unbreakable loyalty from the tribes. Rumors, fueled by jealous reservation chiefs and paranoid military officers, began to circulate that he was planning a massive breakout. The military establishment decided to preemptively neutralize the threat. On September 5, 1877, under the guise of a diplomatic meeting with the post commander, they lured him to the adjutant's office. When he arrived, he was directed instead toward the guardhouse. When Crazy Horse stepped through the door and saw the iron bars and the heavy chains bolted to the floor, the deception was laid bare. The ghost of the plains would not be caged. He drew a hidden knife and fought wildly, slashing at the guards, trying to escape back into the open air. In the ensuing violent struggle, a former Lakota ally turned reservation policeman, a man named Little Bighorn, grabbed Crazy Horse's arms from behind to restrain him. As his arms were pinned, an American infantry guard, Private William Gentles, lunged forward and drove his rifle bayonet deep into Crazy Horse's abdomen, piercing his kidneys. Crazy Horse collapsed onto the hard, packed earth of the fort. The post surgeon, Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy, tried desperately to save him, but the internal trauma was catastrophic. Dr. McGillicuddy's eyewitness accounts detail the final agonizing hours of the great tactician. The soldiers tried to move him onto a cot to make him comfortable, but Crazy Horse violently refused. He had never slept in the white man's bed, and he would not die in one. He lay on the cold floor, his father weeping beside him. In his final breaths, he whispered to McGillicuddy that he had only ever wanted to be left alone, to hunt on the land of his ancestors. He died just before midnight. The United States Army had finally eliminated their greatest nightmare, but they could not capture his legacy. Under the cover of darkness, his parents took his body away into the desolate, winding canyons of the Badlands, hiding his bones in a location that remains undiscovered to this day. He left no photograph to be filed away in a cabinet. He left no signature on a broken treaty. He left only the terrifying, unvarnished truth of a man who fought an empire to a standstill, relying on nothing but the speed of his horse, the sharpness of his mind, and the absolute conviction that his land was not for sale. History is never what you think. To defeat an expanding empire, you do not need the largest army. You need a center of gravity. Look at the high plains of the Dakota Territory in the spring of 1876. The United States government was accustomed to fighting fractured, isolated bands of indigenous people. They relied on tribal divisions to conquer the interior of the continent piece by piece. But in the Valley of the Rosebud, the military intelligence officers stared through their brass spyglasses and realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The valley was not holding a band, it was holding a nation. Thousands of teepees stretched across the horizon. Thousands of horses grazed in the sweet grass. It was the largest gathering of indigenous power in the history of the continent. Cheyenne, Arapaho, Minneconjou, Hunkpapa, and Oglala had buried their ancient rivalries and formed a massive, unprecedented geopolitical coalition. They were not drawn there by the promise of loot, nor by the threat of a single enemy. They were drawn by the spiritual gravity of a single man. A man who carried the heavy, unyielding burden of a prophet. His name was Tecumseh, Sitting Bull. He was not a war chief screaming at the front of a cavalry charge. He was the anchor. He was the architect of the resistance, the spiritual conduit who tied the blood of his people directly to the soil they walked on. And he possessed an understanding of the enemy that was cold, uncompromising, and deeply fatalistic. History is never what you think. The coalition of 1876 was not cemented by a written treaty or a political speech. It was cemented by blood and extreme physical endurance. In early June, as the U.S. military columns began to encircle the Powder River country, Sitting Bull initiated the Sun Dance. This was the most sacred, profound, and physically devastating ceremony of the Lakota. It was a transaction. To gain the favor of the Great Spirit, Wakang Tanka, one had to offer the only thing a human being truly owns, their own flesh. Sitting Bull sat on the dust of the plains. He did not flinch as his adopted brother, Jumping Bull, took a sharp awl and meticulously cut 50 small pieces of flesh from each of Sitting Bull's arms, from the shoulder down to the wrist. 100 cuts. Blood poured down his skin, soaking the earth. He then danced for 2 days and 2 nights around the central cottonwood pole, staring directly into the blinding, scorching sun without food or water. He pushed his physical limits past the point of systemic collapse to achieve a state of absolute clarity. On the second day, he fell into a deep trance. When he awoke, he delivered a vision that would seal the fate of both his people and the United States cavalry. He saw soldiers falling from the sky. They were falling like grasshoppers, upside down, directly into the Lakota camp. The vision carried a clear, unequivocal promise. The Great Spirit was delivering the enemy to them. They would win a great victory. But the vision came with a strict, absolute warning. The dead soldiers were a gift, and one must never take the spoils of a gift. The warriors were forbidden from stripping the dead of their weapons, their clothes, or their horses. If they took the spoils, the Lakota would be destroyed. The greasy grass and the broken contract. Weeks later, the prophecy materialized with terrifying accuracy along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. When the 7th Cavalry, led by General George Armstrong Custer, launched a surprise assault on the massive village, the camp did not shatter. While Crazy Horse and Gall led the kinetic counterattack, obliterating the American troops on the dusty ridges above, Sitting Bull remained in the valley. He organized the defense of the non-combatants, ensuring the women and children were moved to safety, and he made medicine to protect the warriors. The American cavalry fell exactly as he had foreseen, plunging upside down into the dust, completely annihilated. But in the chaotic, blood-soaked aftermath of the greatest victory the plains had ever seen, the spiritual contract was broken. The young warriors, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer scale of the triumph, ignored the warning of the sun dance. They swarmed the battlefield. They stripped the dead cavalrymen of their dark blue uniforms. They took the repeating rifles, the ammunition, the silver watches, and the horses. They harvested the spoils. Sitting Bull looked at the scavenged weapons and the stripped bodies, and he knew the war was lost. They had won the battle, but by taking the spoils, they had doomed themselves to the long, suffocating winter of the Empire's revenge. The United States did not respond to Little Bighorn with another cavalry charge. They responded with a campaign of total logistical attrition. They burned the plains. They slaughtered the bison by the millions. They turned the environment into a weapon of mass starvation. While other chiefs surrendered to the reservations to keep their people from freezing, Sitting Bull refused to bow. In the brutal winter of 1877, he led his followers, around 5,000 people, across the northern border into Canada. The Lakota called it Grandmother's Land, referring to Queen Victoria. He hoped to find sanctuary. Instead, he found the cold mathematics of starvation. The Canadian authorities, represented by the Northwest Mounted Police, respected Sitting Bull. They offered him protection from the U.S. military, but they offered him absolutely nothing else. No rations, no land, no blankets. The first winter was brutal. The following winters were a slow, agonizing descent into hell. The bison herds were disappearing even in the north. The cold was absolute, dropping to 40 degrees below zero. The women were boiling old leather and the bones of dead horses just to make a greasy broth. Sitting Bull watched his people slowly dissolve. He watched the ribs of the children press against their skin. He watched the pride of the greatest warriors on the plains evaporate in the face of an empty stomach. You cannot eat sovereignty. You cannot burn pride to keep a tent warm. By the summer of 1881, the situation had reached a biological zero. His followers had dwindled from 5,000 to a mere 180 starving, freezing souls. The center of gravity had collapsed. To save the children who were left, Sitting Bull crossed back into the United States and rode into Fort Buford. He handed his Winchester rifle to his young son, who handed it to the American commander. Sitting Bull stated that he was the last man of his tribe to surrender his rifle. The ghost of the plains was finally caged. The United States government did not know what to do with a captive prophet. They initially held him as a prisoner of war, fearing that his mere presence would ignite a rebellion. But in 1885, an absurd, distinctly American solution was proposed. Sitting Bull, the architect of Custer's annihilation, was allowed to join Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. The contrast was a surreal, visceral nightmare. The man who had pierced his own flesh to speak with the Great Spirit was now riding a horse around a dusty arena in front of thousands of screaming, cheering white spectators in cities like Chicago and New York. The Americans paid to look at him as if he were a captured apex predator, a terrifying relic of the savage frontier they had just conquered. But Sitting Bull was not a broken attraction. He was a quiet, calculating observer. As he traveled through the sprawling industrial cities of the East, he looked closely at the civilization that had defeated him. He saw the towering buildings and the massive factories, but he also saw the slums. He saw the homeless, starving orphans begging for pennies in the gutters of the very empire that claimed to bring civilization to the world. He was struck with absolute disgust. In the Lakota way, a tribe could be poor, but no individual child would ever starve unless the entire tribe was starving. Wealth was measured by what you gave away, not what you hoarded. He realized that the white society was fundamentally insane. They possessed unimaginable wealth, yet they let their own children rot in the streets. He refused to keep the money he earned from the show. Whenever he stepped out of the arena, he was swarmed by the ragged, starving street urchins of the cities, and he would empty his pockets, giving away every coin he had made that day. He looked at the conquerors and saw a people who possessed power, but lacked a soul. After one season, he walked away from the money and the circus, returning to the desolate, windswept poverty of the Standing Rock Reservation. He preferred to starve with his own people than be a rich man in a society of madmen. By the winter of 1890, the reservations were dying. Disease and malnutrition were rampant. In the depths of this despair, a new, desperate religion swept across the plains: the ghost dance. It was a frantic, ecstatic movement. The believers danced until they collapsed, convinced that if they danced long enough, the earth would roll over, burying the white men, and the bison and the dead ancestors would return. Sitting Bull did not entirely believe in the ghost dance, but he refused to stop his people from performing it. He understood that it was the final, desperate prayer of a dying nation. The United States government, however, panicked. They looked at the dancing and saw the sparks of a massive uprising. They ordered the immediate arrest of Sitting Bull, believing that if they removed the center of gravity, the movement would collapse. But the government did not send the United States cavalry to arrest him. They executed a far more cynical, calculated maneuver. They sent the Indian Agency police. They sent his own people. Before dawn on December 15, 1890, 43 Lakota policemen, wearing the blue uniforms of the federal government, surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin at Standing Rock. The commanding officer was Lieutenant Bull Head, a man who had once been a warrior of the same tribe. They dragged the aging prophet from his bed and pulled him out into the freezing, dark morning. The commotion woke the camp. Sitting Bull's followers rushed out of their teepees, armed with rifles and knives, surrounding the police. The tension in the freezing air was absolute. Sitting Bull refused to mount a horse and go quietly. He stood his ground in the dirt. A warrior in the crowd raised a rifle and fired, striking Lieutenant Bullhead in the side. As Bullhead fell, his finger clenched on the trigger of his revolver. The bullet struck Sitting Bull directly in the chest. Simultaneously, another policeman standing behind him, Red Tomahawk, fired a bullet into the back of Sitting Bull's head. The architect of the Great Coalition, the man who had survived the harshest winters, the greatest battles, and the treacherous politics of two nations, fell dead in the snow. He was not killed by a legendary cavalry commander. He was not killed in a glorious, epic charge on a dusty battlefield. He was shot in the back by his own people, wearing the brass buttons of the empire that had starved them both. It was the ultimate bitter tragedy of the frontier. The machine did not just conquer the land, it turned the blood of the people against itself, ensuring that the final executioner was the very reflection of the man being killed. History is never what you think. Picture the Sonoran Desert in the dead of August. The temperature is 110 degrees in the shade, but there is no shade. The heat radiates off the jagged limestone with enough kinetic force to warp the horizon. The air is so devoid of moisture that it sucks the sweat from your skin before it can even form, leaving a crust of white salt across your uniform. It is 1886. The United States military has deployed a quarter of its entire standing army, 5,000 regular troops, backed by thousands of Mexican soldiers across the border. They have established a network of heliograph stations, flashing mirrored signals across the peaks. They have cavalry columns, supply trains, and repeating rifles. They are scouring the Sierra Madre Mountains in a massive, coordinated dragnet. Who are they hunting? They are hunting 35 people. Not an army, not a regiment. A band of 35 exhausted, starving humans, encumbered by women and young children. At their head is a man in his 60s, his face carved by a lifetime of war and grief. His name is an incantation that makes the entire American Southwest lock its doors. Geronimo. How does a quarter of the United States military spend over a year failing to catch 35 people in a barren wasteland? Because the United States Army was fighting a war of geography. The Apaches were fighting a war of absolute, merciless survival. Today, we are conducting a raw anatomical examination of the Apache Wars. We are stripping away the sanitized myths of the frontier to look at the ultimate asymmetric conflict. We are going to break down the grueling physiology of the desert warrior, the cold mechanics of the raiding economy, and the tragedy that turned a man into an unkillable phantom. To understand why the American cavalry failed, you must first understand the environment. The Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts are not empty sand dunes. They are hostile, vertical labyrinths of razor-sharp agave, deep canyons, and venomous brush. A European-descended soldier dropped into this environment with a canteen and a rifle will be dead from hyperthermia and dehydration within 48 hours. His organic framework simply cannot process the thermal load. The Chiricahua Apache did not just survive in this environment. They were forged by it. Their physiology and their training were optimized for extreme scarcity. The training of an Apache boy was a masterclass in pushing the human machine past the point of mechanical failure. They did not train for strength. They trained for an impossible level of aerobic endurance. One of the foundational exercises involved a mouthful of water. An elder would fill a young boy's mouth with a sip of water. The boy was then ordered to run up the side of a mountain, often carrying a heavy stone, and run back down. If he swallowed the water, or if he spat it out, he failed. This was not a ritual. It was a brutal, calculated physiological hack. By forcing the mouth shut, the body is forced to breathe exclusively through the nose. Nasal breathing filters the dust, but more importantly, it retains internal moisture. It slows the heart rate and trains the body to operate efficiently under a severe oxygen deficit. While a U.S. cavalryman was panting heavily, losing precious hydration with every open-mouthed breath, the Apache warrior was gliding up the rock face, his cardiovascular system operating with absolute silent efficiency. Then came the mastery of the void. We think of camouflage as wearing green and brown clothing. The Apache approach was total environmental assimilation. When an Apache war party needed to disappear, they did not hide behind the rocks. They became the rocks. They understood the thermal and visual signature of the desert. They would strip naked, smear their bodies with wet mud, and press crushed leaves and local dust into their skin. They would bury themselves in the shallow, scorching dirt, leaving only a tiny breathing hole, or wedge themselves into the crevices of a cliff face, perfectly matching the color of the limestone. Cavalry patrols recorded terrifying instances of walking through a seemingly empty canyon, checking every shadow, only to realize the boulders they had just walked past were breathing. The Apache could lie motionless in the baking sun for 12 hours without twitching a muscle, letting a column of 500 American soldiers pass within spitting distance. It was a level of somatic control that the European mind could not comprehend. The United States military operated on a doctrine of territorial control. You take a hill, you build a fort, you hold the ground. The Apache understood that holding ground in a desert is a liability. It makes you a static target. They operated on an entirely different economic doctrine: the raid. To the Apache, war was not about conquest. It was a logistical supply chain. For centuries, they had waged a low-intensity, high-yield war against the Spanish, the Mexicans, and the Americans. They viewed the sprawling Mexican ranches of Sonora and Chihuahua not as sovereign territories, but as unmanaged pantries. Why waste calories trying to farm in the desert when the Mexicans were already raising cattle, horses, and corn? The Apache perfected the art of extraction. A war party would strike a ranch at dawn. They did not engage in pitched battles. They utilized a kinetic, high-speed strike, killing anyone who resisted, taking the weapons, capturing the livestock, and evaporating into the mountains before the local garrison could finish saddling their horses. But the true genius of the Apache machine was the logistics of their retreat. When the U.S. cavalry pursued them, the Americans treated their horses as valuable military assets. They rested them, watered them, and fed them grain. The Apache treated the horse as a disposable organic fuel cell. When a war party retreated, they would ride the stolen horses at a brutal, lung-bursting pace up the steepest, most treacherous inclines of the Sierra Madre. They rode until the animals' hearts literally ruptured from the strain. When a horse collapsed, the Apache did not stop to mourn. They immediately slit the animal's throat, drank the warm blood for hydration, carved off the best cuts of raw meat, and continued on foot. They could transition from light cavalry to elite light infantry in a matter of seconds. They would climb up the vertical rock faces where American cavalry horses would snap their legs. They would eat the horse meat raw, sitting on a high cliff, watching the exhausted, dehydrated American soldiers stumble through the canyon below. By utilizing the livestock they stole as both transport and rations, the Apache completely eliminated the need for a supply train. They carried their logistics in the veins of the animals they rode. It was a ruthless, zero-sum equation that a regular army, tethered to heavy wagons and supply depots, simply could not calculate. To understand the final, desperate holdout, you must understand the man who led it. We know him as Geronimo, but that was not the name he was given. He was born Goyahkla, meaning the one who yawns. He was a respected hunter and a medicine man of the Bedonkohe band, not a chief. His life was not defined by ambition, but by a single catastrophic afternoon in 1858. Goyahkla and the men of his band had traveled into Mexico to trade in the town of Janos. They left their families at a camp outside the town called Casquille. While the men were away, a heavily armed column of Mexican troops, commanded by Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco, ambushed the unprotected camp. When Goyahkla returned, he did not find a camp. He found a slaughterhouse. Lying in the bloody dust were the bodies of his elderly mother, his young wife Alope, and his 3 small children. The human mind has a breaking point. When the organic framework is subjected to absolute, incomprehensible grief, it can either collapse or it can undergo a terrifying transformation. On that day, Goyahkla died. What rose from the dust was a machine fueled entirely by vengeance. He led a retaliatory strike against the Mexican army. During the battle, he fought with such suicidal berserker rage, ignoring the volley of bullets, charging directly into the Mexican lines with only a knife, that the terrified Mexican soldiers began praying to Saint Jerome. "Geronimo! Geronimo!" they screamed as he cut them down. The Apache heard the name, and it stuck. But it wasn't just rage that protected him. To the Apache, Geronimo possessed power. He was a shaman who had experienced a vision. It is said that Usin, the creator, spoke to him and told him that no bullet would ever kill him. Whether you believe in the mystical or the statistical, the physical reality of Geronimo's life defies medical explanation. He was a walking repository of lead and trauma. Over his lifetime of constant warfare, he was shot in the right leg. He was shot through the left arm. He took a bullet to the face, the lead passing through his cheek. He was struck in the back, the bullet grazing his spine. By all the rules of 19th century medicine, he should have died of sepsis, blood loss, or gangrene a dozen times over. But his organic framework refused to shut down. He would pack his wounds with desert herbs, endure the agonizing pain in silence, and return to the warpath within weeks. To his followers, he was a living god of war. To the Americans and Mexicans, he was an unkillable demon who could walk through fire. By 1885, the Apache way of life had been almost entirely liquidated. The vast majority of the Chiricahua were trapped on the San Carlos Reservation, a desolate, malaria-infested patch of Arizona wasteland, affectionately referred to by the soldiers as Hell's 40 Acres. But Geronimo and a small band of 35 holdouts refused to rot in a cage. They broke out, triggering the final, most expensive, and most frustrating manhunt in American history. General George Crook, and later General Nelson A. Miles, brought the full weight of the industrial age against them. Miles deployed 5,000 soldiers. He set up 30 heliograph stations on the peaks of the mountains, using mirrors to flash Morse code across the desert at the speed of light. The Americans were trying to catch a ghost with a telegraph. The 35 Apaches were outnumbered roughly 140 to 1. Yet for over a year, Geronimo's band carved a path of devastation across the border. They would ride 70 miles a day without resting. They would strike a settlement, secure ammunition, and vanish into the Sierra Madre. The American cavalry columns were breaking down. Horses were dying of thirst. Men were dropping from heat stroke, going mad from the blinding sun and the constant paranoid fear of an ambush. The U.S. Army was spending millions of dollars, wearing out thousands of boots, and finding nothing but the ashes of Apache campfires. General Crook finally realized a cold truth. No white man would ever catch an Apache in the Sierra Madre. The biology was incompatible. The only weapon that could find an Apache was another Apache. The U.S. military began heavily recruiting Apache scouts, men from other bands, or even former Chiricahua, who knew the trails, knew the water holes, and understood the psychology of the prey. They put these scouts at the front of the columns. This was the fatal blow. It was not the American rifles that broke Geronimo. It was the betrayal. The scouts relentlessly tracked Geronimo's band deep into the jagged heart of the Mexican mountains. The 35 holdouts were pushed past the limits of human endurance. They had no sleep. Their clothes were in rags. They were out of ammunition, surviving on roots and the sparse water found in the crevices of the rocks. In September 1886, at Skeleton Canyon in Arizona, the machine finally stopped. Geronimo looked at the exhausted, starving faces of the women and children who had followed him into hell. He saw that the United States military would literally pour endless men and endless money into the desert until they were dead. The demographic calculus had reached zero. He walked into the American camp and surrendered his rifle. The surrender of Geronimo marked the end of the Indian Wars in the United States. It was the final gasp of free indigenous resistance on the continent. But there was no honor in the aftermath. Despite promises that they would be returned to their homeland after a brief imprisonment, Geronimo and his people, including the scouts who had helped the Americans track him, were loaded onto sweltering train cars and shipped to prisons in Florida, Alabama, and eventually Oklahoma. The desert ghosts were locked in a humid, alien world. Stripped of the arid air and the high mountains, their immune systems collapsed. Dozens of them died of tuberculosis and depression within the first few years. Geronimo lived for another 23 years as a prisoner of war. The United States government paraded him at the World's Fair, a captive tiger exhibited for the amusement of the society that had destroyed his world. But he never broke. He died in 1909 in a hospital bed in Oklahoma, far from the red rocks of the Sonoran Desert. We read history as a story of technological triumph. We look at the railroads and the telegraphs and believe that the modern world won because it was superior. But if you strip away the machinery and look at the raw, organic reality of the Apache Wars, a darker truth emerges. The United States military did not outfight the Apache. They did not outthink them. They simply had more meat to throw into the grinder. The 35 ghosts of the Sierra Madre proved that a human being, stripped to the absolute essentials, powered by grief and forged by the desert, is the most terrifying weapon on earth. They held an empire at bay not with industry, but with the sheer, unbreakable capacity to endure. The frontier was not tamed by courage, it was suffocated by numbers. On August 16, 1812, an entire American army surrendered without firing a single defensive shot. Inside Fort Detroit, General William Hull stood behind thick timber walls with roughly 2,500 well-supplied soldiers and 33 heavy cannons. Outside waited a combined British and native force roughly half his size. Yet before a single siege trench was dug or a wall breached, Hull raised a white flag, surrendering his men, his artillery, and the entire Michigan territory. How does a fortified garrison collapse before a battle even begins? Later political accounts blamed Hull's personal fear. British military logs called it a stroke of operational fortune. But the historical record reveals a far more deliberate maneuver, a calculated psychological campaign designed to exploit Hull's deepest anxieties. It was orchestrated in part by a Shawnee leader named Tecumseh. In the summer of 1812, Tecumseh mounted arguably the most ambitious attempt to establish a unified indigenous confederacy, one that posed a severe strategic threat to the westward expansion of the young United States. History is never what you think. Fort Detroit did not fall in a single afternoon of clever theater. Its surrender began years earlier, deep inside the oak forests of Indiana, born from a desperate struggle for the land itself. To understand why an American general would hand over a fortress without a fight, one must look at the economic demands placed on the Western territories. Following the Revolutionary War, the United States was deeply in debt, holding vast claims to the continent's interior, but little gold or silver. To pay veterans and fund the government, Washington turned the wilderness into capital, selling native hunting grounds in the Old Northwest to incoming settlers. In the Indiana Territory, Governor William Henry Harrison was the agent tasked with acquiring those tracts of land. Harrison did not rely on open military conquest. He exploited deep fractures between villages and generations. He targeted impoverished chiefs, men dependent on trade goods or annual government payments, and pressed them to cede their lands. In the 1809 Treaty of Fort Wayne alone, Harrison acquired 3 million acres of prime forest for roughly 2 cents an acre. Every month, another treaty erased another stretch of river valley from the map. Council fires split into rival factions. Native communities faced a stark reality: accept territorial fragmentation or find a way to unite before the governor closed the circle. As the treaties eroded their homelands, a profound sense of crisis took hold. Resistance required more than anger. It demanded a spiritual awakening. In 1805, Tecumseh's younger brother, Lalawethika, experienced a series of intense trances. He emerged, took the name Tenskwatawa, the open door, and sparked a sweeping religious revival. Tenskwatawa called for total cultural renewal. He urged his followers to cast off European clothing, throw away iron kettles, and pour trade alcohol into the dirt, identifying the drink as a poison brought to weaken native resolve. Followers gathered by the thousands at a newly established capital, Prophetstown, built precisely where the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers meet. While Tenskwatawa stirred the spirit, Tecumseh built the political framework. Tecumseh was a highly effective diplomat and a deeply respected strategist. Riding from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf Coast, he brought a single, uncompromising message to every council fire: the land belongs to all indigenous peoples in common. No single chief had the right to sell what belonged to everyone. Under Tecumseh's doctrine, every treaty signed with Harrison was legally void. Tecumseh was attempting something rarely seen on the continent: unifying the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Wyandot, Kickapoo, and the Southern Creek into a single defensive front. If he succeeded, American officials feared the United States would hit an unyielding barrier at the Ohio River. Every mile Tecumseh rode brought the region closer to an explosion. Governor Harrison watched Prophetstown grow, realizing that a unified native front could effectively paralyze Western settlement. In the autumn of 1811, Harrison saw his opening. Tecumseh rode south to recruit among the Creek Nation, leaving strict instructions for his brother to avoid any clash with American troops until the Confederacy was complete. Harrison did not wait. He marched a column of 1,000 regulars and militia directly toward Prophetstown, pitching camp less than a mile from the village gates. The proximity of Harrison's forces created an intolerable tension. On the fog-shrouded morning of November 7, 1811, conflict erupted along the Tippecanoe River. Accounts from the time indicate that Tenskwatawa assured the warriors that spiritual power would protect them from enemy lead. Under cover of darkness, native forces struck Harrison's line. The Battle of Tippecanoe was a bloody, chaotic clash in the brush. The warriors inflicted heavy casualties, but as dawn broke, the disciplined volleys and superior numbers of the American infantry forced a tactical withdrawal. Harrison's troops entered Prophetstown, burned the longhouses, and destroyed the winter food stores. Harrison claimed a decisive victory, using it to launch his national political career. But while Tenskwatawa's religious authority was severely damaged, Tecumseh's political vision survived. Returning to find his capital in ashes, Tecumseh realized he could not defend the region alone. Facing a rapidly expanding American military, he needed an ally with regular infantry and artillery. He turned his eyes north, toward British Canada, setting in motion the exact chain of events that would end at the gates of Fort Detroit. When the United States declared war on Great Britain in June 1812 and invaded Canada, British forces faced grim odds. Major General Sir Isaac Brock, military commander of Upper Canada, was vastly outnumbered. He understood that his small force of regulars could not defend the province alone, and that native mobility, numbers, and knowledge of the terrain would be decisive. Brock was a rare commander for his era. He respected Tecumseh, trusted his military instincts, and treated him as an equal partner in command. When the two men met at Amherstburg, their objective was immediate and singular: Fort Detroit. Inside the fort, General William Hull held 2,500 troops and heavy artillery. Outside, Brock and Tecumseh commanded a force roughly half that size. Brock lacked the numbers for a protracted siege. Tecumseh lacked heavy siege guns. What they shared was a complete understanding of Hull's fears. They launched a coordinated campaign of deception. British officers permitted dispatches to be intercepted, exaggerating the number of northern warriors arriving daily. Brock then sent a formal demand for surrender, containing a chillingly calculated warning. "It is far from my inclination to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond my control the moment the contest commences." Then came the visual theater. Contemporary accounts and later recollections describe Tecumseh marching his warriors past a gap in the tree line in full view of the fort, cycling them back through the dense brush, and marching them past again to inflate their perceived numbers. Inside the fort, Hull watched through his glass as what appeared to be an endless tide of warriors surrounded his position. Paralyzed by the fear of an unbridled assault on his garrison and the civilians sheltered inside, Hull's willingness to fight dissolved. Without a single breach made in the walls, General Hull raised a white flag and surrendered Fort Detroit. Tecumseh's strategy had worked. The indigenous front Harrison tried to crush at Tippecanoe had just captured the centerpiece of the Northwest. The bloodless capture of Detroit shifted the momentum of the war. Thousands of warriors flocked to Tecumseh's banner, and for over a year, the British-Native partnership successfully held the Western theater. But this success relied heavily on a fragile command structure. In October 1812, General Brock was killed in action at the Battle of Queenston Heights. His successor, Major General Henry Proctor, was a cautious commander who lacked Brock's daring and held little confidence in his native allies. Trust began to unravel. The crisis came in September 1813, when American forces won the Battle of Lake Erie. Without control of the water, British forces could no longer receive rations or ammunition, effectively cutting off the supply lines to Detroit. Panicked, General Proctor ordered a rapid retreat eastward into Ontario, abandoning Fort Detroit and burning his own supply depots. Tecumseh was furious. He confronted Proctor directly, arguing that retreating abandoned the very lands they had sworn to defend. He famously compared the fleeing general to a frightened animal running from a fight, its tail tucked between its legs. Tecumseh knew that a prolonged retreat would cause his multi-tribal force to scatter. He forced Proctor to turn and make a stand along the Thames River near present-day Chatham, Ontario. On October 5, 1813, the Battle of the Thames began in a swampy oak forest. The British defensive line was poorly prepared. Proctor deployed his exhausted regulars in a thin line across open timber, their artillery rendered useless without proper ammunition. Positioned in the dense swamp to their right were Tecumseh and his warriors, anchoring the flank in the heavy brush. William Henry Harrison, now commanding the American Army of the Northwest, launched a rapid assault using mounted Kentucky volunteers. The demoralized British line shattered within minutes, and General Proctor fled the field. Tecumseh and his warriors stood alone, mounting a stubborn defense in the swamp. Eyewitnesses described intense hand-to-hand fighting through the thick powder smoke. During the engagement, Tecumseh was killed. The exact circumstances of his death remain disputed. Kentucky Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson later claimed to have fired the fatal shot, a claim he leveraged to become Vice President of the United States. Primary accounts conflict, however, and Tecumseh's body was never officially identified by American forces. Following his death, surviving warriors withdrew into the swamp, carrying his body with them. His burial site was kept secret, hidden so effectively that its location remains unknown today. The death of Tecumseh marked the collapse of one of the most formidable indigenous coalitions in North American history. Without his leadership, the Confederacy fractured into isolated factions, and individual tribes were forced to sign away their remaining lands piece by piece. Over the next 2 decades, as American settlement swept across the continent, the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Wyandot, and Ojibwe were systematically dispossessed and driven west of the Mississippi River. Yet Tecumseh's campaign was not merely a tragic prelude to removal. It was a moment when the geopolitical map of North America almost changed forever. He came within a single military partnership of establishing an independent indigenous nation in the center of the continent. As the autumn rain washed the smoke from the swamp along the Thames River, the British regulars retreated, the American army claimed the West, and the warriors melted back into the deep woods, taking the body of Tecumseh with them. They buried him in the dark soil of the region he had fought to save, leaving behind no marker, no monument, and a lingering question of what North America might look like today had he lived.